Hello everyone, welcome back to the Learning Highway. Have you ever wondered what drives and produces the incredible diversity and complexity of life on Earth? It's all about biological evolution. This is the first of my three-part series about it, and in this video we will be learning about the fundamental mechanisms and genetics of evolution. There are two main parts to evolution: mutation and selection. Let's explore mutation first. Reproduction is essential to mutation. All organisms reproduce either asexually or sexually. Bacteria and archaea, both simple single-celled organisms, reproduce asexually. That is, one of them can produce another one by itself. No mating required. Like you saw in that clip of bacteria reproducing. When the DNA is copied for reproduction, little changes happen that make it different from the parent's DNA. So the offspring would be slightly different from its parent. This is what mutation is. A gene is a chunk of DNA that codes for a specific protein, and a mutation in that gene is called an allele. For example, the genes that code for eye color have alleles for blue, green, black, etc. If an individual's genes are good, it has a higher chance of surviving and therefore reproducing. That individual would have a lot of descendants, and those descendants would probably carry the good alleles too. You see, the good alleles spread throughout the population because the individuals who carry them have a higher reproductive success. And of course, the bad ones would eventually die out because they give individuals lower reproductive success. This is called selection. So let's imagine a population of E. coli bacteria. They all descended from one individual bacteria some time ago, and due to some random mutations that happen along the line, half of them are highly antibiotic resistant and the others aren't. So the genes that code for antibiotic resistance here have alleles for high resistance and low resistance, and at first, both are equally present in the population. The allele frequency of a given allele is what percentage of the organisms in the population have that allele. So the allele frequency for each allele here is 50%. Alright, let's say these bacteria infect humans, but the humans have developed antibiotics. Now the high resistance bacteria have an advantage over the low resistant ones. This is called selection pressure. Eventually the low resistant bacteria die out, leaving the high resistance bacteria to survive, spread, and eventually the whole population is high resistance. Even if the number of high resistance bacteria was very low at first, they would have taken over eventually. It would have just taken more time. You see how this works? Alright, we got how mutation and selection works in asexually reproducing organisms. But how about in sexually reproducing living things, like animals, plants, and fungi? Most sexually reproducing living things have two sets of DNA and produce offspring that inherit one set of DNA from each parent. This is called diploidy. In diploid organisms, there are two kinds of alleles: recessive alleles and dominant alleles. Recessive alleles have to be in both sets of DNA to actually give the living thing the traits they code for, or to be expressed. Dominant alleles only need to be in one set of DNA to be expressed. Some living things have more than two sets of DNA. They are called polyploids, for example the gray tree frog shown here. Polyploids still have dominant and recessive alleles. And while more DNA doesn't necessarily mean more complexity, imagine how much room for alleles and genetic diversity there is within these species. However, we'll stick to calculating allele stuff for just diploids now, since it can get very complicated for polyploids. Now let's imagine a population of 10 rats. They all descended from 2 rats a few years ago. Due to some random mutations that happened along the line, 40% have an allele for gray fur, and 60% have alleles for white fur. Now, it's not as simple as 40% are gray and 60% are white. Remember, these are diploid living things. The gray fur allele is recessive, and the white fur allele is dominant. All the gray alleles plus all the white alleles are 100%, right? Just like all the high resistance alleles plus all the low resistance alleles equals 100% for our bacteria scenario. But now, each individual has 2 alleles for fur color, one for each set of DNA. So the equation is white alleles plus gray alleles squared equals 100%. If we plug the frequency of white alleles and the frequency of gray alleles into this equation, we can actually calculate what percentage of the population is actually white or gray. Also given that we know which allele is dominant or recessive. Oh, first let's change this 100% to 1. That'll make it easier to calculate. Okay, now let's plug in our variables. 60% of the population has white alleles. 40% has gray alleles. So 0.6 plus 0.4 squared equals 1. Okay, now let's expand this equation so we can calculate it. 0.6 squared is the part of the population that has only white alleles. 2 times 0.6 times 0.4 is the part of the population that has one white allele and one gray allele. And 0.4 squared is the part of the population that has two gray alleles. Okay, so that equals 1. Look, there's our expanded equation. Alright, so 0.6 squared is 0.36. 2 times 0.6 times 0.4 is 0.48. And 0.4 squared is 0.16. Does that all equal 1? Yes. Now, we've calculated the percentage of mice in the population that have two white alleles, a white allele and a gray allele, and two gray alleles. Since white alleles are dominant, that means they have to be at least in one set of genes to be expressed. Even the animals that have one white allele and one gray allele would still be white. The animals with two gray alleles would be gray because there's no white allele, right? And gray has to be in... White is the dominant allele, remember? It has to be in at least one set of DNA to be expressed, while gray is recessive and has to be in two sets of DNA to be expressed. So mice with a white allele and a gray allele would be white, because the white allele expresses itself while the gray one doesn't. Mice with two white alleles or two gray alleles, of course, would be white or gray respectively. So if we add up the percentage of mice with two white alleles and the percentage with one white and one gray allele, we get 84%. So 84% of mice are white and 16% of them are gray. If we add some selection pressure, like moving them onto a rocky hill, where gray fur is better because it provides camouflage, eventually the white-furred mice would die out, and the mice with two gray alleles would survive and spread. Also, do you notice something else? Individuals don't evolve. Only populations evolve. The genes you get at birth are the genes you have for the rest of your life. Alright, let's recap. We learned the concept of alleles, how to calculate the frequency of traits in a population if we know which alleles are dominant and recessive, and we know the frequency of the alleles. How good mutations in organisms increase reproductive success and therefore spread throughout the population, while the bad ones die out because they decrease reproductive success. But now, are you wondering how evolution actually plays out in the real world? That will be covered in the second video of this series, which is linked in the description. Thanks for watching, and as always, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. Bye! See you next time!